Hello, and welcome to Course 9 of Oregon's third-party verification training. My name is Bill Peters, and I'm the Interim Clean Fuels Program Manager. This course presents an overview of the verification requirements for annual fuel pathway reports submitted to the Clean Fuels Program. For any questions related to this training program, please contact us at 3pverify@dq.oregon.gov. In this module, we will discuss some of the similarities and differences between the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality's Clean Fuels Program and California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard programs, and how the third-party verification programs for both of those work. Some parts of this module include a review of some of the CARB 3PV training program materials. As a disclaimer, material covered in this module does not replace the verifier's responsibility to know and comply with verification requirements in Oregon Administrative Rule, Chapter 340, Division 272. If at any point the materials in these slides conflict with those in the rules, the regulation is what controls. This module also assumes you've already completed other training materials, namely the previous modules in this training along with the California Verification Program, which introduced the Clean Fuels Program and the Oregon third-party verification requirements. Just a note here that DEQ is currently working on a rulemaking to adopt new versions of the ORG-REAP model and calculators. These changes may take effect in 2025 if they are proposed and approved by the Environmental Quality Commission, which is DEQ's rulemaking body that oversees it. As currently proposed, 2025 and 2026 annual fuel pathway reports would need to contain both the current ORG-REAP 3.0 calculator and the new ORG-REAP 4.0 calculator, both of which would be subject to checks by you, the verifiers. The data provided in these calculators is basically identical, so we'd be using the two models to confirm compliance with both the currently certified CI values and then using them to issue new ones with the new model to be used for 2026 and future reporting. If the rulemaking is approved, DEQ will provide supplemental training for verifiers and fuel producers on the 4.0 models, which are based on the CalGREAT 4.0 models that they currently have open in their rulemaking as of the time of this recording. DEQ is also proposing to make validation required for original fuel pathway applications, but not recertifications that have already gone through a California validation or verification cycle, and also to create additional attestation requirements for specified source feedstocks. Please pay attention to this rulemaking. It's the 2024 rulemaking for the Clean Fuels Program, and hopefully that rulemaking will be wrapped up by January of 2025. A basic definition of the term fuel pathway means basically that it's a detailed description of all stages of fuel production and use for fuel, including feedstock generation or extraction from the source, taking that feedstock to the fuel producer where it's then refined into whatever the transportation fuel is, distributing it to the end users, and then combustion of that fuel by the consumer. We use these fuel pathways and define them out to figure out what the appropriate life cycle carbon intensity value is for all the fuels used by the Clean Fuels Program. The annual fuel pathway reports that you review contain and update these CI values. When we discuss verification services for fuel pathways, we're really talking about two separate review processes. Verification services for fuel pathway applications are known as validation, while services provided after the submission of an annual fuel pathway report to check that report are typically referred to simply as verification. For annual fuel pathway reports, verification will also need to cover operating conditions that DEQ writes for fuel production facilities that may specify additional reporting or data collection requirements for their calculators that you will need to evaluate and verify. Now I'm going to walk through how our workflow for pathways from two different angles. One is kind of a broader overview of how pathways are used in the program, and the other is our process for pathway review. Initially, the fuel producer comes into the Alternative Fuels Portal, or AFP, and registers their facility. They then use that registration to submit a fuel pathway application through that same portal. DEQ will evaluate those materials. In a future version of the rules where validation is required, this is the stage where the fuel producer would be required to seek validation from a verifier and then have that validation submitted prior to DEQ doing our full review. except in the case of Tier 2 pathways where DEQ may need to do an initial review, determine that the application is complete, and then release that application package to the verifier along with some draft operating conditions for whatever process that that Tier 2 application covers. Fuel pathway application processes are somewhat iterative in nature as we go back and forth as many times as we need to with the fuel producer or fuel pathway holder in order to make sure that there is no missing or incorrect data and that we fully understand the fuel production process. Once we validate that the information is indeed correct, and we mark that application as complete, and then we can do a final evaluation of it. At that time, DEQ develops a staff summary that has operating conditions. These operating conditions will include anything specific to their case that they need to maintain data reporting or accurate use of their fuel pathways, and then we'll send them a staff summary. That staff summary includes all of those operating conditions listed out. If the producer accepts the staff summary and the final carbon intensity values that DEQ is willing to certify, including ideally a margin of safety, then we'll go ahead with the final certification process. Once those CIs are certified, they then can be used by the fuel pathway holder along with all the other reporting entities that might use that fuel in quarterly fuel transaction reports, and credits will be issued as their reporting dictates. All fuel producers then need to submit annual fuel pathway reports each March, and we'll talk a little bit more about the dates and requirements for that in just a moment. We're going to go through a brief review of life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is the approach, and the GREET model is the tool that we use to assess and calculate specific carbon intensity values. There is the Oregon-specific GREET model known as ORGREET, which is a version of the California GREET model. Basically, we've taken that model and modified it in order to accurately represent Oregon transportation fuels where there are differences between the two. We also use other models in order to feed in to the ORGREET model. That includes the OPG model, or the Oil Production Greenhouse Gas Emissions Estimator model for crude. There are also values in GREET that we've derived from other models, including the GTAP model and C-Club models for indirect land use change. We use GTAP for all the fuels that are crop-based other than North American corn ethanol, where C-Club is used. The system boundary for all of our life cycle assessments is broadly identical between the Oregon GREET and the California GREET methodological approaches for life cycle analysis. The Tier 1 ORGREET calculators are closely identical to the corresponding California GREET calculators and are filled out in basically the same way. Because of that, we're not going to go through each of those calculators in the same level of detail that you saw them in when you went through the California verification training. Some emissions factors are different between the two calculators, and DEQ includes an Oregon grid mix for electricity that's being used in state in any of these fuel pathways. There is one additional Tier 1 calculator in Oregon for dairy and swine manure to electricity projects, which is largely identical to the RNG version of that calculator. All that's been changed is that we've added some additional cells and formulas for the electricity generator portion of that pathway, where it's being converted to electricity rather than being injected into a pipeline. The main difference between the two on the liquid fuel side, especially for corn ethanol, is that the C-Club model results in a different ILUC estimate, which is about 12 grams lower than the one in the CalGREET model for corn-based fuels. And then the denaturant for ethanol carbon intensity contribution is higher in ORGREET due to different emissions factors. Transportation miles and modes are generally going to be different between a ORGREET pathway and a California GREET pathway, just because the fuel comes to Oregon. In a lot of cases, we'll maybe see some barge transit of fuels and California very rarely sees that. So it just depends on whatever the pathway is and what the path to get to Oregon is. There are also going to be some different values about the EF tables, the emission factor tables and fuel specification tables that are different due to the fuel coming to Oregon. For example, we have a different crude oil carbon intensity value, and then the fossil fuel carbon intensity values are generally slightly different due to both that different electricity grid emissions and refinery emissions in the Northwest versus California. We also use conventional gasoline and normal ultra-low sulfur diesel, which also lead to some slight differences from California Air Resources blend gasoline. As mentioned earlier, the annual fuel pathway report is used to demonstrate compliance with a previously certified fuel pathway carbon intensity. The verification team must help assess the conformance with the operating conditions during verification, so you will need to have the staff summary from the applicant in order to fully understand what the operating conditions are that they're operating under. Annual fuel pathway reports are submitted to us by March 31st of each year, and annual fuel pathway applications can be submitted anytime. It's just when the fuel producer is ready to submit an application to us. For annual fuel pathway reports, the verification statements are due on August 31st. Any validations done for fuel pathway applications, the verification statements for those should be done within 6 months of them being submitted. The annual fuel pathway report will include the certified CI calculator updated with the most recent 2 years of operational data, and annual attestations and other data as appropriate for the fuel pathway, depending on what they're using and what the operating conditions require, be reported in addition to just the updated GREET model. If the operational CI is lower than the certified CI, the fuel pathway holder may elect to either keep the currently certified CI or request the DEQ replace the certified CI with the new lower CI score that they managed to maintain. At any point in that process, they can also elect to add a margin of safety to account for process variability. Most of what we'll cover in today's presentation will be relevant to the verification of Oregon certification fuel pathways that have not been previously certified in California. In the case of those annual fuel pathway reports submitted by Oregon pathway holders, the full verification requirements of Oregon Administrative Rule Chapter 340, Division 272 apply, including hiring a DEQ approved verification body, completing conflict of interest assessments and disclosure, and the submission of the verification statement to DEQ that meets those regulatory requirements. At the end of the presentation, we'll cover what happened in the case of recertification pathways, which are pathways that have been previously certified by the California Air Resources Board and then submitted for recertification in Oregon. All fuel producers whose pathways generate over 6,000 credits and deficits must be verified. For recertification pathways, the California verification statement will suffice, except that if a producer is eligible for deferred verification in California, but their pathways have generated over 6,000 credits and deficits in Oregon, then their annual fuel pathway report must be verified under Oregon's verification program. The verification of annual fuel pathway reports applies to holders of certified fuel pathways who have supplied any site-specific CI data for pathway certification, which is basically all of them. It also covers, to the extent that a fuel production facility has included specified source feedstocks in its pathways, the data around those specified source feedstock suppliers and other entities that have provided site-specific CI data that have applied as a joint applicant with the fuel producer. And also verification applies to both Tier 1 and Tier 2 pathways. Generally, the validation process is identical to the verification process. It's just, if it's coming in during a fuel pathway application versus an annual fuel pathway report. The annual fuel pathway report uses the same calculator as the original application, including potentially modifications if it's a Tier 2 application. But it is just updated to include the most recent 2 calendar years of operational CI data to confirm that the certified CI value is still accurate and appropriate. The annual fuel pathway report includes the certified CI calculator Oregon GREET 3.0 model, so updated with the most recent 2 calendar years of operational data, along with any other materials that have been required to be submitted, either because the pathway requirements in our regulations dictate that they must submit additional materials, such as for renewable natural gas pathways, or because the operating conditions specify additional reporting requirements. If the reported operational CI in that annual fuel pathway report is lower than the currently certified CI for that pathway, the fuel pathway holder may request to either keep the currently certified CI or request to lower the CI down to what is reflected in the updated annual fuel pathway report. But they are also allowed to add a margin of safety to that CI to account for process variability. DEQ processes these requests after the verification process for the annual fuel pathway reports for all pathways has been completed. The supply chain subject to verification includes the steps from feedstock supply to fuel production to distribution and use of the fuels. Joint applicants and intermediate facilities may assume responsibility for different portions of the chain of custody evidence needed for specified source feedstocks. These points apply to fuel pathways that use certain low carbon or specified source feedstocks, which are mainly ones like used cooking oil or animal fats / tallow and renewable natural gas. Specified source feedstocks are at risk for falsification, and thus because of that, we require that chain of custody evidence must be kept. They're at risk for falsification because they're assigned a lower CI score. A used cooking oil does not have all the farming emissions associated with it in the way that we do the life cycle analysis for this program. So if you mislabel virgin soy oil as used cooking oil, you would lower the carbon intensity of that resulting fuel by 20 to 30 grams and thus generate more credits from it, thus the risk for falsification. The verification team must use its professional judgment and include in its risk assessment sampling plan analysis for the need of a desk review or site visit for verification of any entity in the feedstock chain of custody for specified source feedstocks. This analysis must include an evaluation of the need to trace feedstock through to feedstock suppliers, including aggregators, storage or pretreatment facilities, and traders and brokers back to the point of origin for that feedstock. For example, a used cooking oil, the point of origin may be a restaurant or an industrial food processor. If an error is detected during data checks of records maintained by the responsible entity, the risk assessment and sampling plan must be updated to assure that specified source feedstock characterization and quantities are accurate to the point of origin. To give an example, Facility A is a biodiesel production facility that uses tallow, used cooking oil, distillers corn oil, and crop-based oils for their pathways. The distillers corn oil and crop-based oils are all applied for using the default emissions factors for those fuels. So the scope of verification for those pathways is just the volume of those feedstocks coming into the facility and the rest of the facility's operations. For used cooking oil and tallow, the scope of verification is broader and includes tracing feedstock transfer documentation from the point of origin for the facilities through to that fuel producer. In this example, that means that from the 2 used cooking oil points of origin through to the collection center for that used cooking oil, through to a trader that then sells the used cooking oil to the biodiesel producer. In the case of the rendering facility, that verification may also need to include a review and publish the site visit of that facility if site-specific data for rendering has been provided instead of the default values. Lastly, we have so far discussed what happens when an annual fuel pathway is submitted for a fuel pathway certified in Oregon. However, most of the pathways that we deal with are known as recertification pathways, or pathways that are previously certified by CARB, where the fuel pathway holder would like that pathway recertified for use in Oregon. With recertification pathway, DEQ accepts the verification materials from CARB in lieu of requiring a separate full verification in Oregon for those same pathways. As a result, holders of these pathways will have to use the California approved verification body to perform services and do not need to submit either a conflict of interest form or other verification statements using the Oregon program. They do need to submit the verification statement, as we'll go into in the next slide. Fuel pathway applications submitted to DEQ that have been verified under CARB's LCFS must submit the materials. For responsible entities that operate facilities with 1 or more Oregon fuel pathway codes that are recertification of the California fuel pathways, verification statements submitted to CARB must be submitted to DEQ according to the verification deadline specified under OAR 340-272-0100, which is the general requirements for verifications of reports and fuel pathway applications. For responsible entities that operate facilities with one or more field pathway codes that are not a recertification of Oregon field pathway codes but have active California field pathway codes, then you must refer to OER 340-272-0110, Rule 2, Section C, subsection II. Field pathway applications and annual field pathway reports are due on March 31st, and the verification statements are due on August 31st. For both of those, we will move the deadline to the next business day if that day falls on a weekend or an Oregon state holiday. Quarterly reviews are not required, but they can be used by reporting entities in order to catch errors earlier in the process and address them prior to submittal of either an annual field pathway report or as part of the quarterly fuel transaction reporting process.